It started with a car that never stopped coming, and a voice that could turn friendly in one breath and dangerous in the next. By the time she realized she was trapped, escape wasn't about running. It was about surviving the people who owned her life. You never forget the sound of a phone call that cracks your world in two. It doesn't matter how loud the city hum is outside, or how many years have passed since the last time you thought about that chapter of your life. The moment a stranger's voice says they're from the police, and they want to talk about your teenage years, time folds in on itself. Suddenly, you're not who you are now. You're back there. A kid, scared, confused, and small. The air around you thick with threats you can't unhear. The years you've spent trying to bury it all are peeled back with a single question. Can we have a chat about what happened to you? It was supposed to be a normal summer afternoon in a Yorkshire town. The kind of day where you grab your bag, step out into the street, and your biggest concern is the weather turning on you before you get home. But in an instant, the present dissolved. Her knees buckled, the hum of traffic vanished, and the memories came, not in a trickle, but a flood that stole her breath. Back then, long before that call, life had felt ordinary. A small, tight-knit family. A dad who carried the warmth of his Irish roots like a badge of honor. A mum who ran the home with quiet authority. And a daughter who adored both of them in different ways. Saturdays were for helping Dad on jobs in his battered truck. Feeling important just holding a ladder in place while he worked. Evenings meant laughter over sitcom reruns. Summers, they crossed the sea to County Kerry, where the rain was as familiar as the welcome. It wasn't a rich life in money, but in love, it was overflowing. But small towns, even the ones that feel safe, can have shadows no one talks about. They're not just in dark alleys or rundown estates. They move in plain sight, in parks, in takeaway queues, in the spaces where teenagers linger, looking for something to make them feel older than they are. She didn't know it yet, but her life was on a collision course with people who thrived in those shadows. At first, the cracks were small, almost invisible. The first was school. The uniform that felt new and hopeful on the first day, the friends from primary who made the transition easier. All of it eroded fast under the weight of teenage cruelty. It only took one shouted insult, "Oi, fatty!" to mark her as different. And in the brutal ecosystem of adolescence, being different was blood in the water. The bullying wasn't clever, but it was relentless. Snickers in the canteen, chairs pulled away, plates of food tipped onto the floor. Every jab landed harder than the last, until her days became an exercise in invisibility. Home was the only refuge, but even there, she kept quiet. If her parents knew, they'd make it worse by getting involved. So she coped the way many do, with small, secret comforts. A bar of chocolate here, a packet of crisps there. It worked in the moment, but the bullies noticed, and the cycle deepened. The second crack came in the form of escape. Started small. Skipping the odd class, lingering too long at lunch. Then, one damp morning, she and a friend bolted across the school field, laughing so hard they could barely run. The rush of getting away was intoxicating, the kind of adrenaline hit that made the gray drizzle feel like sunshine. No one caught them. No one even seemed to notice they were gone. That, more than anything, was what hooked her. In a life where she felt constantly cornered, truancy was freedom she could choose. And once you've had a taste of freedom, the classroom feels like a cage. The third crack didn't feel like a crack at all. It felt like the opposite. One morning at the bus station, older boys, no men, drifted over. They weren't from school. They weren't even close to school age. They had the swagger of people who didn't wait for buses. They drove. One of them, tall, with a neat goatee and spotless boots, asked her name, offered her a cigarette. He called himself Pretos. It was the first time in months anyone had looked at her without cruelty in their eyes. He didn't care about her size. He didn't smirk when she spoke. He made her feel chosen. By that afternoon, there was vodka in her hand, music in the air, and the faint burn of cigarette smoke in her lungs. She went home with mint on her breath to mask the smell, the whole encounter sitting in her chest like a secret treasure. From there, it moved quickly, as these things always do. The park became the meeting point. The micra became the escape vehicle. There was always a bottle to pass around, always a reason to drive, just a bit further. In those early weeks, it didn't feel dangerous. It felt like belonging. These older boys gave her things freely, drinks, cigarettes, kebabs, without asking for money. They didn't mock her. They didn't roll their eyes when she spoke. Compared to the cold hostility of school, it was intoxicating. But beneath the surface, rules were being rewritten without her noticing. Boundaries that once felt firm, where she could go, who she could be with, blurred until they vanished. And every small step she took with them was leading her somewhere she couldn't yet see. One night, Pretos mentioned a party. The word made her think of music, laughter, maybe a buffet table. The reality was different. A smoke-filled living room, a dozen older men she didn't know, drinks that burned like petrol, pills passed into her palm. She told herself it was a test, that holding her own here would make her part of the group. She didn't see it for what it was, an environment designed to strip away resistance, to keep her off balance, pliable. By the time she staggered upstairs, her body wasn't hers to control. The room spun. The duvet beneath her felt like an anchor. And then there were hands, pulling, taking. Her mind drifted in and out, catching fragments of words she couldn't piece together. When she woke, the air was heavy, and the man who'd once called her gorgeous was smirking down at her. The space between her legs hurt. The Carey football shirt she'd been so proud to wear was twisted, her jeans on the floor, and deep inside, something had been hollowed out. That was the night the cracks split open into a chasm. She wouldn't see it all at once. Grooming rarely announces itself. Creeps in one choice at a time until the choices aren't yours anymore. But the path was set, and the girl who once held her dad's ladder, proud to be his right-hand helper, was now balancing on a far more dangerous rung, one that could collapse without warning. In the days after the so-called party, she didn't tell anyone what had happened. Not her mom, not her dad, not even her closest friend. It wasn't just fear, it was confusion. How do you explain something you're not even sure you understand yourself? The gaps in her memory felt like holes punched in a photograph. She could see fragments, the room, the bed, the smirk. But the in-between was a smear she couldn't focus on. Part of her wanted to write it off as a bad night, a drunken blur. That's what she clung to, because the alternative, that something was done to her while she couldn't fight back, was a truth too heavy to pick up. And besides, the very next day her phone lit up. "Missed you yesterday." It was from him, Pretos. Not an apology, not a question about whether she was okay. Just a reminder he was still there, still in her orbit. And whether she liked it or not, part of her was relieved. When you're 14, attention can feel like affection. And in the emotional desert that bullying had carved out at school, this attention was an oasis, even if the water was poisoned. So she went back, to the park, to the micra, to the drinks, the cigarettes, the places that would have made her parents' blood run cold if they'd known. This time, she told herself, she'd keep her guard up. She'd laugh, she'd drink, but she wouldn't let it get out of hand. The problem was, out of hand wasn't just about alcohol. It was about control, and the men around her had already started mapping out the weak spots in her life. They knew when her mom worked late. They knew when her dad was on a job until evening. They knew which friends could be relied on to cover for her, and which ones would spill under pressure. And slowly, subtly, they began to separate her from anyone who might pull her back. "You don't need those school friends," Glenn told her one afternoon, his arm draped around her shoulders as if they were a regular teenage couple. "They're just jealous. We're the ones who actually care about you." It was intoxicating to hear. After all, these men didn't laugh at her body. They didn't sneer at her clothes. Around them, she wasn't fatty or Miss Piggy. She was someone. She mattered. But there were rules now, unspoken at first, then sharper in their edges. If she couldn't make it to the park, her phone would buzz with questions. If she didn't answer, the messages got colder. "Where are you? Don't mess me about. You're with someone else?" The first time she pushed back, Pretos laughed it off. The second time, his tone hardened. "Don't forget who looks after you," he said. "Who gives you what you want. You think anyone else will." It wasn't phrased like a threat, but it didn't need to be. At home, things were changing too. Her mum's questions were sharper, her dad's silences longer. One evening, after she slipped in just before curfew, her mum stopped her in the hallway. "You've been different lately," she said, eyes narrowing. "Secretive. Is there something I should know?" "No," she lied automatically. "You're imagining things." But she could feel the weight of her dad's gaze from the sofa. He didn't say anything, just turned back to the television. That was worse, because if her mum's anger was like a slap, her dad's quiet disappointment was like a bruise that didn't fade. The gang's tactics shifted. Now it wasn't just meeting in the park. It was lifts to out-of-town takeaways, trips to unfamiliar estates, places where no one knew her name, and she wouldn't recognize anyone even if she needed help. She told herself it was exciting, that it meant she was part of something bigger, more important than the boring loop of school, home, bed. But deep down, she'd started carrying a knot of unease. It sat low in her stomach, tightening every time the car doors locked, every time they drove further than she'd expected. One Friday evening, as the sky turned from gold to the bruised purple of dusk, Pretos pulled up outside the park. She climbed into the back seat, expecting the usual routine: music, booze, a lazy cruise around town. Instead, the car headed out along the bypass. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Don't worry," he said, eyes still on the road. "You'll like it." She glanced at Glenn beside her. He gave a small shrug. The music was loud enough to drown out further questions. By the time the streetlights gave way to darkness, she knew they were miles from home. The house they stopped at looked ordinary: pebble-dash walls, net curtains, a satellite dish. But inside, it was the same atmosphere as the party before. The stale tang of smoke, too many men in one room, eyes that lingered just a second too long. She told herself she'd stay near Glenn, that he'd keep things safe. But within minutes, the bottle was in her hand, and the floor was shifting under her feet. Somewhere, deep in her mind, a voice whispered that she should leave, that she should call her dad, or at least Macy, and get out before the night turned. But the louder voice, the one they'd been feeding for months, said, "Don't be stupid. This is what fun looks like." The truth was, the fun was never free. Every drink, every cigarette, every ride had a price. They just hadn't told her what the cost would be yet. And when they did, she'd realized the debt was already far deeper than she could repay. For weeks, she'd believed the drinks, the cigarettes, the rides in the micro came without strings. That was part of the illusion, part of what made it so easy to keep saying yes. It felt like generosity, like loyalty. But loyalty, she was about to learn, only ran one way. It started with a small comment. One afternoon, she climbed into the back seat and Pretos handed her a bottle. "We've been good to you, yeah?" he said. She laughed nervously. "Yeah, course. So when we ask you to do something for us," he went on, "you'll do it. No drama, right?" It was half a question, half a statement. She nodded because nodding was easier than asking what he meant. The somethings at first were harmless, at least on the surface. Delivering a bag to someone's front door, passing a message to a man waiting outside a shop, holding on to a phone for a few hours. Little tasks, nothing that screamed danger. But each one blurred the line a bit more. Each one chipped away at her sense of choice. And with every task completed, the pressure to say yes the next time grew heavier. At home, the tension was getting harder to hide. Her mum was still sharp-eyed, still sniffing out the changes, the smell of smoke on her clothes, the way she flinched at certain questions. Her dad stayed mostly silent, but there was a distance in his eyes now, like he was bracing himself for something he didn't want to see. She told herself they were overreacting, that they didn't understand the world she was in now. But late at night, lying in bed with her phone buzzing on the pillow, she felt the truth pressing in. If they really knew, they wouldn't just be worried. They'd be terrified. The first real demand came on a rainy Tuesday. Pretos parked outside the park gates and didn't bother turning down the music when she climbed in. "We need to go somewhere," he said. "Won't take long." She glanced at Glenn. He was looking out of the window, unreadable. "Where?" she asked. "Don't matter," Preto said. "You're coming." It wasn't phrased like an invitation. It was an order, and something in his tone told her that not going wasn't an option. The estate they drove to was one she didn't recognize. The houses were run down, curtains drawn even though it was barely evening. A few men stood on a corner, hoods up despite the rain, watching as the Micra rolled past. Inside the flat they stopped at, the air was thick with the smell of cheap takeaway and something sharper, the bittersweet tang of cannabis smoke. The television was on, but no one was watching. She stayed near the door, hands in her pockets, wishing she was invisible. A man she didn't know handed Pretos a small bundle wrapped in cling film. He tucked it into his jacket without breaking eye contact with her. "Good girl," he said, like she'd done something to deserve the praise. They were gone again within minutes. The bundle passed to someone else 2 streets away. It wasn't until much later that night, when she replayed the day in her head, that she realized she'd just been part of a drug run. No one had said the words. No one had explained. But it didn't take much to connect the dots. And even though she hadn't touched the package, the realization sent a cold ripple down her spine. From then on, the errands became part of the routine. She told herself it was fine. She wasn't the one selling anything. She wasn't the one getting paid. But deep down, she knew better. The free drinks didn't feel as free anymore. Neither did the rides, the meals, the spliffs passed casually from hand to hand. Every gift was a hook, and she was tangled in the line. The control didn't stop there. The texts came at all hours now, demanding to know where she was, who she was with, when she'd be available. If she didn't respond quickly enough, there'd be knocks at the park gate, or a car idling at the end of her street. They knew her movements better than her parents did. And slowly, her world shrank to fit theirs. The day they told her what they really wanted, it wasn't in a dark room or a back alley. It was broad daylight, in the park where it had all begun. Pretos leaned against the car, watching her. "You've been good to us," he said. "We've looked after you. Now it's your turn." She didn't understand at first. Then she saw the way Glenn wouldn't meet her eyes. The price wasn't just about running errands anymore. It was about her. That was the moment the ground beneath her shifted for good. Because once they'd said it out loud, there was no pretending she'd misread the situation. No telling herself it was just friendship, just fun, just belonging. The mask had dropped, and the faces behind it were nothing like the ones she thought she knew. By the time she understood what they were asking of her, she was already in too deep. That was the genius and the cruelty of how they'd played it. They didn't demand everything at once. They took it in small pieces, slowly enough that by the time the big ask came, it felt inevitable. And when she hesitated, the warmth in their voices cooled. "We've been good to you," Pretos said again, this time without the easy grin. "We've kept you safe. You think that comes for nothing?" The word safe rang in her ears. It was supposed to mean protection, but from the way he said it, it felt like a threat. She glanced at Glenn, hoping for backup. But he didn't speak. He just studied the ground, kicking a stone back and forth with the toe of his trainer. That silence said more than words could. That afternoon, she learned something important. The gang's protection only existed as long as she obeyed. Refusal wasn't just frowned upon, it was dangerous. At first, the coercion came wrapped in flattery. "You're special," they told her. "We wouldn't ask just anyone." But when flattery didn't work, they leaned on fear. "We know where you live," Pretos reminded her one evening. "We know your mom's shifts. Your dad's van. Don't make us do something stupid." The next time she was in the Micra, the doors locked as soon as she got in. Not by accident, she heard the click, saw the way Pretos checked the rearview mirror. "Relax," he said, but his tone was flat. "We're just going to see someone." They drove to a flat she didn't recognize, somewhere on the edge of town where the street lamps flickered and whole rows of houses sat in darkness. Inside, a man she'd never met was waiting. Her stomach twisted before anyone spoke. There's a moment, a split second, when your body knows you're in danger before your brain catches up. Your pulse spikes. Your hands get cold. Everything in you screams to run, but your feet feel like they're sunk in concrete. She felt it then, standing in that doorway. The man smiled, but it wasn't a kind smile. "Come on in," he said like they were old friends. She shot a look at Pretos, but his face was unreadable. "Go on," he said, and in that moment, she understood that whatever happened next wasn't about choice anymore. Afterwards, the drive back was silent. No jokes, no music, no kebab shop stop. Just the steady thrum of the engine and the occasional squeal of tires as Pretos took corners too fast. When they pulled up near the park, she climbed out without a word. Her legs felt like they didn't belong to her. At home, she went straight to the bathroom, turned the shower on full, and sat on the floor under the spray. She stayed there until the hot water ran out, until the steam gave way to cold mist. And still, she didn't feel clean. She told herself she wouldn't see them again, that she'd block their numbers, avoid the park, stay home after school. But the next day, a message lit up her phone. "Don't be stupid. You know the rules." When she didn't answer, another came. "We can make life very hard for you. And your family." The threats weren't loud or dramatic. They were quiet, precise, personal, because they knew exactly which levers to pull. And so the pattern began. They called, she went. They told her where to be, and she showed up. Every time, she told herself she was just buying time, just doing enough to keep them from turning on her completely. But every time she gave in, the hooks went deeper. Isolation became a weapon. If she tried to spend time with school friends, her phone would buzz relentlessly. If she didn't reply fast enough, there'd be someone outside her street, waiting. If she told her parents she was staying in, they'd dangle information about where her family had been, who they'd seen, proving they were always watching. It wasn't just about keeping her under control. It was about making sure she knew control was impossible to get back. By the time winter came, she barely recognized the girl she'd been a few months before, the one who'd spent Saturdays laughing in her dad's truck, the one who'd felt proud of a bedroom TV. That girl still existed somewhere, but she felt far away, like a memory from another lifetime. And in her place was someone who couldn't make a move without looking over her shoulder. The first time they threatened her family, it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a casual remark, dropped into conversation between drags of a cigarette. "We saw your mum getting off the bus earlier," Preto said. He smiled as he said it like he was talking about the weather, but the words landed heavy. From then on, their awareness of her family's movements became part of the script. They'd mention her dad's van parked outside a building site miles away. They'd comment on what her mum had been wearing at work. Sometimes they'd ask if her younger cousins still walked home from school the same way. It wasn't small talk. It was a message: we see everything. Fear changes how you think. It makes you careful about every word, every choice, every look. And when the people you fear are in your life every day, you learn to edit yourself constantly. She stopped talking about her parents when she was with them. She didn't mention plans for the weekend, didn't say who they were visiting. She held those details tight, as if hiding them could somehow protect the people she loved. But protection had never really been hers to give. One evening, after she'd kept them waiting at the park, the tone shifted. "You don't keep us waiting," Glenn said. His voice wasn't raised, but the way he stepped closer made her chest tighten. "You don't make us look for you. Understand?" She nodded, heart pounding. "Good," he said. Then, almost as an afterthought, "Because next time we don't just have a word. Next time, someone gets a visit." The violence, when it came, was quick and calculated. It wasn't the wild, angry kind that leaves bruises in obvious places. It was the sort that reminded her what they could do if they wanted. A shove against a wall, fingers digging into her arm hard enough to make her gasp, a hand gripping the back of her neck until she couldn't move, always followed by the same line: "Don't make us do that again." At home, she was coming apart in ways her parents couldn't name. Her mum noticed the way she jumped at sudden noises, the way her appetite shifted from nothing at all to eating anything in sight. Her dad saw how often she kept her jacket on indoors, how she stayed close to her bedroom door as if she needed an escape route. But when they asked, she brushed it off. "Just tired," she'd say. "Just school." The truth was unspeakable, not just because of the shame, but because she believed saying it out loud would put them in danger. By winter, the nights closed in early, and darkness became another tool the gang used. They'd call her out late, knowing she'd have to slip past her parents half asleep on the sofa. They'd meet her in unlit car parks, side streets where even the sound of the Micra's engine seemed too loud. The cold made her breath visible, and she hated how easy it was to see she was shaking. Then came the night that stripped away the last of her illusion that she could somehow manage this. It was after 10 when Pretos called. She didn't answer. She'd been trying to give herself one night without them. Minutes later, a stone clattered against her bedroom window. She froze. Another stone. Then another. She crossed to the window, pulled back the curtain just enough to see the dark shape of the Micra idling at the end of the street. The headlights flicked on, and she knew it was for her. She crept out, telling herself she'd make it quick. The moment she climbed in, the locks clicked. "You don't ignore us," Preto said. His tone was calm, almost conversational, which only made it worse. "We were nice about it this time. Next time we go see your dad. Have a little chat." Her chest tightened. She could picture it too clearly. The knock at the door, her dad's puzzled look. The moment he realized he wasn't dealing with someone from the building trade. It wasn't just her life they could wreck. It was theirs. That was the night she stopped thinking about escape as something she could just do when she was ready. Escape now meant risk. Not just for her, but for anyone with her name, anyone tied to her by blood. The gang had made sure of that. Once the threat to her dad was on the table, she stopped testing boundaries. It wasn't just fear of what they'd do to her. It was the image of her father, blindsided, dragged into something he didn't understand. That picture lived in her head now, every time the phone lit up. From that point on, compliance became her survival tactic. The days blurred into a pattern. School in the morning, although she rarely made it to all her classes. The park in the afternoon, then into the Micra or whatever car they were using that day. A drive to somewhere she didn't recognize. A man she didn't know. Sometimes there were multiple stops. Sometimes they'd make her wait in the car while they handled business. Then call her inside as if she were part of a transaction. The specifics of each day faded in her mind. What stayed was the constant, the fact that it was every day. Her phone was never silent. If they weren't telling her where to be, they were checking she was there. If she didn't respond in minutes, the messages got sharper. "Don't forget what we said. Answer or we come round." And when she did answer, the tone would swing back to casual, even playful, as if the threat had never been there. That unpredictability was part of the grip. She never knew which version of them she'd get, so she learned to tread lightly all the time. Home wasn't a refuge anymore. It was a stage where she performed normal for her parents. Eating dinner, asking about their day, pretending to care about TV shows she wasn't really watching. But her mum was noticing the cracks. "You're hardly here anymore," she said one night. "And when you are, you're somewhere else. What's going on?" She shook her head. "Nothing. Just school stuff." It was easier to let her mum believe she was moody and distant than to admit the truth. Because if she told them, they'd have to act. And acting would put them in the line of fire. The lies multiplied. Where she'd been, who she'd been with, why her clothes smelled of smoke, why she had cash in her bag when she didn't have a job. Each lie built a wall between her and the people who'd always been her safe place. And behind that wall, the gang's voice grew louder than her own. One evening, she came home later than usual. Her mum was waiting in the hallway, arms folded. "Where were you?" "At Macy's." "Don't lie to me," her mum snapped. "Someone saw you getting out of a car on the other side of town." Her pulse thudded in her ears. Must have been someone else. Her mum stared at her for a long moment, then said quietly, "You don't look like my daughter anymore." The words lodged in her chest, heavy and sharp. But she still couldn't tell the truth. Meanwhile, the gang kept tightening the screws. It wasn't enough for her to be available when they called. They wanted her always available. One afternoon, when she tried to leave early, Glenn grabbed her wrist and squeezed hard enough to make her eyes water. "You leave when we say you leave." She nodded quickly, not because she agreed, but because she'd learned that argument meant escalation. By now, she understood something she hadn't at the start. The abuse wasn't an accident of circumstance. It was the point. The errands, the rides, the drugs, they were just the scaffolding around it. The real business was control, and she was part of the product. And even though she hated it, even though some nights she lay awake staring at the ceiling, promising herself she'd find a way out, she knew the truth. She was already living in the trap. By spring, the line between her life and theirs had vanished. She didn't meet them anymore. She belonged to their timetable. Her old friends noticed first. At school, she stopped sitting with them at lunch. She didn't answer calls. If they passed her in the corridor, she'd be walking fast, head down, as if she was late for something. At first they thought she was just caught up in a new romance. Then the whispers started. They'd seen her with older men, in cars that never stopped near school unless she was there. Within months, the whispers turned into distance. People stopped asking where she'd been. They stopped looking her in the eye. And without realizing it, she'd lost her last link to the life she'd had before. School itself was a ghost of what it had been. Some mornings she didn't show up at all. Other days she stayed just long enough to get her mark in the register, then slipped out to meet the micra. The teachers noticed, of course. They sent letters home, called meetings she didn't attend. But in her head, school was irrelevant. It wasn't going to save her. It wasn't going to protect her from the men waiting at the park. The first time she saw them use violence in public, it wasn't even directed at her. She was in the back seat, music thumping, when Preto spotted someone on the street and swerved to the curb. Before she could ask what was happening, he was out of the car, crossing the pavement in 3 long strides. The man on the street, younger, maybe in his 20s, barely had time to turn before Preto shoved him hard against the wall. The punches came fast, mechanical, not wild, not loud, just efficient. When it was done, the man staggered away, holding his face, blood bright on his knuckles. Preto's got back in the car like nothing had happened. "Disrespect me, that's what you get," he said, lighting a cigarette. She didn't ask who the man was or what he'd done. The message wasn't for him. It was for her. From then on, she didn't just fear what they might do behind closed doors. She feared what they might do where anyone could see. It made the idea of saying no almost unthinkable. Because if they were willing to hurt someone in the middle of the street, what would they do to her or her family if she defied them in private? Even the way they touched her changed. Before, it had been in cars, in flats, in rooms where no one else was looking. Now, they'd pull her close in public, their hands on her in ways that made it clear to anyone watching that she wasn't just hanging out with them. She'd catch people staring, then looking away quickly. She knew what they saw, and the shame of it burned, but the fear burned hotter. At home, her parents were at their limit. Her mum's anger had given way to suspicion, then to a brittle sort of patience that felt worse than shouting. Her dad tried to keep the peace, but even he started pushing. "You can't keep doing this," he told her one evening. "You're out late, you don't answer your phone, and you look tired, love. Worn out." "I'm fine," she lied, because what else could she say? If she told him the truth, she pictured the same ending every time. Him confronting them making good on their threats, and her left with blood on her hands she'd never be able to wash away. By now, the gang didn't even need to threaten her outright. Every bruise she saw on someone else, every story she overheard about a lesson being taught, every glance from Preto's when she hesitated, all of it was a reminder. The trap wasn't hidden anymore. She was standing in it, and they were holding the rope. The tension at home had been building for months, but it didn't explode in a single fight. It cracked quietly, like a rope fraying one thread at a time until you suddenly realize it's about to snap. Her mum had stopped believing anything she said. If she claimed she was at a friend's, her mum would check. If she said she was at school, her mum would call the office. And when the answers didn't match, there was no shouting anymore, just a silence that was heavier than any argument. Her dad tried to bridge the gap, but even his patience was wearing thin. "You're making it hard for us to trust you," he said one evening, not unkindly. "When you're ready to tell us what's going on, we'll listen. But until then, you're shutting us out." The truth was, she wasn't just shutting them out. She was shutting herself in. The fewer details they knew, the safer they were. At least that's what she told herself. The gang had noticed her growing distance from her family, and they used it. "You don't need them," Glenn told her one night. "They don't get you. We do." It was a line they'd used before, but now there was a new edge to it. They weren't just offering her belonging. They were pushing her to sever the ties she still had left. Then came the first time they asked her to bring someone else. It sounded harmless. "You got any mates who'd want to come hang out?" Pretos asked casually, like he was talking about a night at the cinema. "You know, have a laugh? Bit of music, couple drinks." Her stomach tightened. She knew exactly what hang out meant in their world. She tried to shake her head. "Nah, my mates aren't into that." "Course they are," Pretos said, smiling like it was already settled. "Just tell them it's a party. They'll come. And you'll be doing them a favor." The way he said favor made her skin crawl. She didn't bring anyone that night. But a few days later, they pressed again, harder this time. "You want to stay in our good books?" Glenn said. "Bring someone. Doesn't have to be your best friend. Just someone who'll come along for a drink. We'll take it from there." It wasn't a request anymore. That weekend, she messaged a girl from school. Not a close friend, but someone she knew was having a rough time. She didn't spell anything out. She didn't warn her. She told herself it was just drinks, just music. But when the girl climbed into the back of the Micra and saw the same faces she'd once found so charming, the same bottles and packets passed around, she knew. She knew exactly what she'd done. Guilt hit harder than fear that night. It stayed with her, following her into bed, into the shower, into school corridors. She'd been on the other side of that first meeting, wide-eyed, naive, thinking she was in control. Now she'd delivered someone else into the same trap. And the worst part? The gang knew she'd do it again. They'd seen the way she'd gone along with it. They'd seen her silence. At home, she was quieter than ever. Her mum put it down to attitude. Her dad thought she was depressed. Neither of them guessed she was carrying the weight of someone else's safety, and the knowledge that she might have just broken it. From then on, the requests came more often. "Your mate from school. She coming out again? What about that girl you were talking to in the park?" Sometimes she resisted. Sometimes she gave in. But each time she gave in, it was easier for them to ask again. And with each yes, the person she used to be slipped further away, replaced by someone she barely recognized. Someone who wasn't just a victim anymore, but part of the machinery that kept the whole thing running. The guilt didn't fade. It sat in her chest like a weight, heavy in the morning and heavier at night. Every time she saw the girl she'd brought in, there was a flicker of recognition. Not a smile, not a nod, just a look that said, "I know you know what happened." She tried to avoid her at school, but corridors aren't wide enough to keep out that kind of shame. Her mental health started to slide. The things she used to do to cope, music in her bedroom, long showers, walks to the shop, didn't help anymore. Now her head felt crowded all the time, like there was never silence. She was sleeping less, eating less. The cigarettes weren't just for show anymore. They were something to do with her hands when she couldn't stop them shaking. And when she looked in the mirror, she didn't see herself. She saw someone hollowed out, someone living on borrowed time. But something else was shifting, too. For months, the gang had been the only ones watching her. Now, other eyes were starting to follow. It began with a teacher asking her to stay behind after class. "You've been absent a lot," the teacher said gently. "And when you are here, you seem somewhere else. Is everything okay?" She muttered something about being tired, about home being stressful. Anything but the truth. Because if she told them, the gang would know. They always knew. The real warning came a week later. She was heading to the park when she noticed a man standing by the gates. He wasn't from school. He wasn't one of them. "Christina?" he asked. She froze. "I'm with the police," he said, showing an ID badge. "We'd like to have a chat." Her pulse roared in her ears. She didn't even hear the rest of what he said. Just the word police and the certainty that if she stopped, if she talked, the gang would find out. She shook her head, walked past him, and didn't look back. By the time she reached the Micra, she could feel eyes on her from somewhere behind, but she forced herself not to turn around. Inside the car, Pretos glanced at her. "Who was that?" "No one," she said too quickly. The problem was, she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in from both sides now. If the police were taking an interest, that meant the gang would be more paranoid. And paranoia in men like that didn't lead to caution, it led to violence. It also meant more pressure on her. They'd want to know exactly what she was saying, where she was going, who she was talking to. And if she didn't have answers, they'd find their own. That night, her phone buzzed with a new message. "You hear from anyone you shouldn't be talking to?" She stared at the screen, heart hammering. She typed back, "No." Another reply came instantly. "Good. Keep it that way." The next day, she caught the girl she'd brought into the gang looking at her again. But this time, the look wasn't just hurt. It was fear. And that was when she realized, if the police were asking questions, it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all of them. The second police approach came just days later. This time, it wasn't on a quiet street or outside the park. It was in the open, in the middle of the high street after school. "Christina," a woman's voice called. She turned to see a plainclothes officer, holding up an ID wallet just enough for her to catch the badge. "I need to talk to you. It's important." Her instinct was to keep walking, but the woman stepped in front of her, not blocking her path completely, just enough to make it awkward to slip away without drawing attention. "I know you're scared," the officer said, voice low but urgent. "We're looking into something that happened to you, and to other girls. You're not in trouble. We want to help." The words "other girls" hit like a punch. Her throat went dry. She glanced around, scanning the shopfronts, the parked cars. Any one of them could be watching. "I can't," she whispered, and then she stepped around the officer and walked away. By the time she reached the park, the Micro was already there. She could see Pretos in the driver's seat, sunglasses on even though the sky was heavy with clouds. Glenn leaned against the bonnet, smoking. She got in, trying to keep her voice even. "Sorry I'm late." "Who was that you were talking to?" Pretos asked without looking at her. "No one," she lied. He reached into the glove compartment and took out her phone. She hadn't even noticed him lift it from her jacket. "Then you won't mind if we check." The search was quick. Messages, call logs, social media. Nothing for them to find because she hadn't dared send or receive anything they'd see as betrayal. But the fact they'd taken her phone at all told her everything. The trust, thin as it had been, was gone. "Remember," Pretos said, handing it back, "we hear you've been talking to the wrong people, we'll know. And you won't like what happens next." From then on, the surveillance wasn't subtle. Sometimes, a car she didn't recognize would idle near the school gates. Other times, she'd catch sight of Glenn a few rows back on the bus when she went into town. Even when she was home, she wasn't sure she was out of sight. Once, late at night, she glanced out of her bedroom window and saw the faint red glow of a cigarette tip in the shadows across the street. It might have been nothing, but she didn't believe in coincidences anymore. The police didn't give up. A week later, she found a note slipped into her school bag. "If you want to talk, we can keep you safe." A phone number scrawled at the bottom. She read it over and over in her bedroom that night, her heart pulling in two directions. One side whispered, "This is your chance. Get out. Tell them everything." The other hissed, "They can't keep you safe from what these men can do. And they'll know it was you." She tucked the note into a shoebox under her bed, where it stayed like a secret she couldn't commit to. The turning point came one evening when the gang told her to get in the car. No explanation, no discussion. They drove her to an unfamiliar estate, pulling up outside a flat where the curtains were drawn even though the lights inside glowed. "You're going in there," Glenn said. "What for?" she asked, her voice smaller than she meant. "Doesn't matter," Pretos replied. "Just do it." She stepped inside and instantly knew she was in trouble. Two men she'd never seen before were waiting. The door clicked shut behind her. The rest of the night blurred into fragments. Hands grabbing, voices arguing in another room, the taste of cheap spirits burning her throat. When it was over, she walked out into the night air, unsteady, her mind screaming at her to keep moving, to make it back to the car without falling apart. In the car, no one spoke. They didn't have to. The message was clear. There was no choice left to her. Whatever the police were offering, whatever escape she imagined, it was fantasy. The reality was this: they owned her, and they wanted her to know it. After the night at the flat, she stopped pretending to herself. Whatever tiny scraps of control she'd once thought she had were gone. Now it was just endurance, doing what they said, surviving each day, and hoping nothing worse happened tomorrow. But the problem with living in constant survival mode is that mistakes become inevitable. And with people like them, one mistake could be fatal. The police were still circling. Another note appeared, slipped through the zip of her school bag when she wasn't looking. Another voice calling her name outside the gates, urging her to just give us a few minutes. She ignored them all, but she could feel the tension in her body ratcheting tighter each time, because she knew it was only a matter of time before someone from the gang saw an approach happen. That moment came on a damp Thursday afternoon. She'd stayed late at school for once, lingering in the library just to be somewhere quiet. When she stepped out into the gray light, an unmarked car rolled to a slow stop beside her. A woman in plain clothes leaned out. "Christina, I'm DC Shaw. Can we have a word? Just you and me." It was the first time she'd heard an officer use their name with her. And maybe that's why she hesitated just long enough to make the worst mistake. Across the road, a familiar shape was leaning against a lamppost. Glenn. He had his hood up, but she'd know his stance anywhere. He'd seen the car. He'd seen her pause. And he didn't move. She panicked. "I can't talk," she blurted to the officer, before walking away fast. Not running, but fast enough to look like she was escaping something. That night, her phone buzzed. "What was that about?" She typed back, "Nothing. Wrong person." The reply came immediately. "Don't lie to me. We'll talk tomorrow." Sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she pictured two scenarios: the gang dragging her out somewhere to explain herself, or the police showing up at her house in full view of her parents and neighbors. By morning, she'd convinced herself she could still smooth things over. All she had to do was act normal, answer whatever questions they had, and make it clear she wasn't talking to anyone. But normal didn't cut it. When she met them at the park, Pretos was already in the driver's seat, engine running. Glenn sat in the back, motioning for her to get in. The silence in the car was worse than shouting. Finally, Glenn said, "You've got friends you're not telling us about. That's not smart." "I don't," she insisted. "Then prove it," Pretos said, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "From now on, you tell us where you are every hour. You miss a check-in, we'll assume you've got something to hide. It was surveillance dressed up as permission. We'll let you live your life, as long as you report to us while you do it." And the worst part was, she agreed instantly. Not because she wanted to, but because refusing wasn't an option. That night, she lay in bed with her phone beside her, sending a message every hour on the hour. Sometimes they didn't even reply, but the silence didn't feel like freedom. It felt like they were reminding her that she was still under watch, even when she couldn't see them. The hourly check-ins worked exactly as intended. They weren't about information, they were about conditioning. After a week, she didn't need reminders or threats. Her fingers moved to her phone automatically, even in the middle of a conversation, even in class, just to type. At school, at home, at the park. It was muscle memory now, and they knew it. The toll showed up in her body first. She was sleeping in fragments, never more than a couple hours at a time before her mind jolted her awake to check the clock. Food lost its taste. Some days she couldn't keep anything down. Her stomach knotted too tightly. Her mom noticed the weight loss. "You're looking pale," she said one evening, trying for casual but failing. "Just tired," came the automatic reply. It was the same excuse she'd been using for months, but now it felt truer than ever. Except tired didn't even scratch the surface. The gang didn't care how she looked, only that she was where they wanted her, when they wanted her. And they were getting creative with how they pulled her in. Sometimes it was the usual text, "Come to the park." Other times it was a sudden change of plan. "Meet us at the shop on Hall Street," as if they were testing how quickly she'd drop whatever she was doing. If she was too slow, they'd make her pay for it. One Tuesday afternoon, She got the message while walking home from school. She was only 10 minutes away, but traffic was heavy, and she ended up late. When she arrived, Glenn was leaning against the car, arms folded. "You think we're waiting on you now? I came as fast as..." The slap came so fast she didn't even see his hand move. Her head whipped sideways, a sharp taste of iron flooding her mouth. No shouting, no second blow. Just the single hit, followed by silence that made her wish he'd yelled instead. She nodded quickly, swallowing the tears threatening to spill. "I won't be late again," she said. "Good," Glenn replied, stepping back. "Let's go." And that was it. The conversation was over like it had been about the weather. Back home that evening, she caught herself in the bathroom mirror. Her lip was split, but she knew how to hide it. A little makeup, a careful story about biting it during lunch. Her parents didn't question it. They'd learned not to, or maybe they were too afraid of the answers. The violence didn't have to be frequent to be effective. It wasn't about punishment. It was about keeping her off balance, making sure she never forgot what they were capable of. Even on the days they were almost friendly, she kept waiting for the switch to flip, because she'd learned there was no such thing as safe with them. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, one of those days where she was on autopilot, just moving from one meeting point to the next because that's what she'd been trained to do. The location this time was different. Not the park, not the corner shop. A rundown cafe on the edge of town that always smelled faintly of burnt toast and grease. She pushed the door open and saw her, the girl she'd brought into this months ago. The girl looked worse than the last time they'd crossed paths. Her hair was dull, her clothes rumpled like she'd slept in them. She sat hunched at the table, eyes darting between the doorway and the street outside as if she was waiting for someone to come through and make her flinch. When she noticed Christina, she didn't smile. She didn't scowl either. She just stared, and in that stare was something sharp. Not blame exactly, but recognition. They weren't alone for long. Glenn appeared from the back of the cafe, clapping a hand on the girl's shoulder before sliding into the seat beside her. "You two know each other, yeah?" The girl didn't answer. Christina nodded once, keeping her face blank. "Good," Glenn said, as if that settled something. "Makes things easier." But as the conversation around them moved on, deals, money, names she didn't know, Christina noticed something. The girl wasn't playing along. She didn't nod when Glenn talked. She didn't laugh at Preto's half-jokes from the counter. Her eyes stayed fixed on her tea, both hands wrapped tight around the mug, as if it was the only thing keeping her grounded. It was defiance, but not loud defiance. Quiet, calculated. Later, outside, they ended up walking in the same direction for a few minutes before the micro came to collect Christina. The girl spoke first, low and fast. "They're not as untouchable as they think." Christina glanced around, panic spiking. "Don't. I'm just saying." The girl cut in, voice barely above a whisper. "People talk. Mistakes get made. They're not careful all the time." Before she could reply, the micro pulled up, ending the moment. That night, the words wouldn't leave her. Not as untouchable as they think. It clashed with everything she'd been told, everything they'd made her believe. For months, the gang had built themselves up as unstoppable, beyond the reach of anyone, least of all the police. But if that wasn't true, what else had they lied about? She tried to push the thought away. Hope was dangerous. It made you act differently. It made you take risks. And yet, over the next week, she started noticing small things she'd ignored before. Arguments between Glenn and Pretos that weren't just banter. Times when they showed up later than they said, looking agitated. One night when Pretos' knuckles were split and he muttered something about sorting a problem, but didn't sound like he was bragging. They weren't invincible. And that realization, tiny as it was, lodged itself in her mind like a splinter. She wasn't ready to act on it. Not yet. But she was watching differently now, not just for threats, but for weaknesses. It was just after dark when the night cracked open. She'd been sitting in the back of the micra, half listening to Glenn talk about some job he was working on, when the sudden flash of blue lit up the street. For a split second, no one moved. Then Pretos cursed and slammed the car into reverse. They didn't get far. Another police car blocked them from behind, and a third appeared at the end of the road. Doors flew open, shouts filled the air. Out of the vehicle! Now! Her stomach dropped. She'd pictured being caught with them before, but in her imagination, she'd always been able to walk away if she played her part right. Now, surrounded by uniforms and torches, she wasn't sure there was a safe way out at all. A female officer pulled her aside almost immediately, asking her name, her age, how she knew the men in the car. She could feel Glenn and Pretos watching her from where they were being questioned, even as they tried to act casual. If she said the wrong thing, they'd know. If she said the right thing for the police, they'd still know. Either way, she'd be the one to pay. She lied. Quickly, cleanly, the way she'd practiced in her head 100 times. They're just mates. Gave me a lift. I didn't know anything about whatever this is. The officer's eyes searched her face. You don't have to protect anyone, she said. If you're in trouble, we can help you. But trouble was relative. The police couldn't be at her house at 3 in the morning if the gang decided to come knocking. In the end, they let her go. No arrests that night. Just searches, a lot of questions, and a warning to stay out of cars that aren't going anywhere good. She walked home alone, every step heavy with the knowledge that they'd be contacting her soon. When her phone finally buzzed, the message was short. We need to talk. Tomorrow. The meeting wasn't what she expected. No shouting, no threats, just Pretos pacing, running a hand over his face. They're getting bold, he muttered. Too bold. We need to tighten up. It was the first time she'd ever seen him unsettled. His voice was clipped, his usual swagger stripped back to something closer to nerves. They gave her new rules that night. No public meetups unless she was told an hour before. No phones unless they handed them to her. And if the police approached her again, she was to say nothing, not even a lie, without calling one of them first. It was meant to protect them. But all she could think was, the cracks are real, and they're widening. For the first time, she wasn't just surviving. She was storing information. How quickly they moved when surprised. How their stories didn't always match. The way they reacted when they didn't feel in control. She didn't know what she'd do with it yet, but she knew it mattered. It started with a fight. Not a quick flare of temper in the street, but a full-on, dragged-out brawl that left Glenn bleeding and the other guy barely able to stand. It happened outside a takeaway in the early hours, a place with bright CCTV cameras mounted above the door, recording everything. By midday, the footage was all over social media. 2 men swinging fists, shoving each other into parked cars, shouting words you didn't need to hear to understand. Glenn didn't even bother to hide his face. The video spread faster than rumors at school. By the time she saw it, her stomach turned to ice. Everyone in town now knew Glenn had a temper, and more importantly, so did the police. When she met them later that day, Pretos was fuming. You think they're not watching us already? He snapped. Now you're handing them evidence. Glenn just shrugged, nursing a split lip. They've got nothing, just a scrap. Not a crime. But Christina could see it. Behind Pretos' anger, there was fear. That fear turned into action. They needed an alibi for Glenn. Something solid to throw the police off if they came asking. And for reasons she didn't understand until it was too late, they decided she was going to provide it. You were with him that night, Pretos told her flatly. At yours, watching TV. That's the story. She opened her mouth to object, but the look in his eyes made the words die in her throat. It didn't matter that it wasn't true. It didn't matter that her parents would never back it up. They weren't asking her to lie. They were telling her to. She played it out in her head that night. What would happen if the police came knocking? She could tell the truth, maybe get Glenn in trouble. But the fallout wouldn't end there. Or she could lie, become part of his defense, and tie herself even tighter to them. Either way, she'd be the one carrying the risk. The next day, the police did come. 2 officers at the door, polite but direct. Do you know Glenn, full name? One asked, notebook ready. We're looking into an incident in the early hours of Sunday morning. Her heart pounded so hard she thought they could hear it. Yes, she said, keeping her tone even. He was with me that night. She forced a little laugh. We were just watching TV. Didn't even go out. The officers took notes, asked a few more questions, and left. But she knew this wasn't over. The lie was now part of an official report. And if the truth came out, she'd be dragged down with him. Later, Glenn texted, "Good job. Oh, you won." She didn't reply, because she knew owing in his world didn't mean a favor she could cash in. It meant a debt that kept her in his pocket for as long as he wanted. The fight didn't fade from local memory. If anything, it seemed to take on a life of its own. People whispered about it in shops, at bus stops, outside the school gates. And every time the clip resurfaced online, it dragged her back into the anxiety of knowing she'd helped cover for him. It wasn't just gossip anymore. The police were moving. A week after the incident, 2 detectives turned up at school. They didn't pull her out of class this time, they waited by the gates. One of them, the same female officer from before, gave her a small nod. "We just need to clarify a few details," she said gently. "It won't take long." Her hands felt cold, even though the sun was on her face. She stuck to the lie. "Yes, he was with me. I've told you that before." The officer held her gaze a moment longer than necessary. It wasn't disbelief she saw there, it was disappointment. When she told the gang about the meeting, they didn't look relieved. They looked calculating. "You're solid," Preto said, almost approvingly. Not everyone can keep their story straight. It felt less like praise and more like being branded. A mark that told them she was reliable under pressure, the kind of person they could lean on for dirtier work. She decided she needed an escape plan, not an impulsive run in the night. She knew enough about how they worked to realize that wouldn't get her far. It had to be slow, careful, invisible. So she started small, paying attention to which streets the Micra avoided, noticing when Pretos used a different phone, watching where Glenn's temper got the better of him and who it scared. She didn't know exactly what she was collecting this for, but deep down, she knew the day would come when those details mattered. In the meantime, she kept playing her role. She laughed at their jokes when she had to. She answered the check-in messages like clockwork. She made herself blend into their world so completely that they stopped looking too closely at her. But she was always listening. The cracks she'd started to see after the police raid were still there, only now they were widening. Glenn had started drinking more, turning up late to his own meetings. Preto spent more time on the phone than with the crew, always stepping away to take calls he didn't want overheard. And sometimes, late at night, she caught him with an expression she'd never seen before. Not anger, not arrogance, worry. She didn't know what was coming next, but she could feel it, like a storm building just beyond the horizon. And if she was smart, if she was careful, maybe she could find a way to step out of its path before it hit. It started with silence. Not the quiet of a calm night, but the kind of silence that means something's gone wrong. The absence of phone calls, the lack of messages, no one showing up where they usually do. She didn't know it yet, but the police had just pulled the first thread. 2 days later, the news hit the estate. One of the gang's bigger players, a man she'd only met twice, but whose name carried weight, had been arrested in a dawn raid. Word spread that the police had seized cash, drugs, and phones. The phones were what scared them most. Everyone knew that once the police had a handset, it wasn't just the owner in trouble. It was everyone who'd ever been on the other end of a call. She expected panic. Instead, she got something worse. They started pointing fingers at each other. "Someone's been talking," Glenn said flatly, eyes moving from face to face like he was searching for the weakest link. Pretos didn't say much, but the way he lit one cigarette straight off the end of the last told her his head was spinning through possibilities. Her own name was never spoken, but she could feel suspicion circling like a shark. They'd already seen her near police before. They knew she'd been approached. It wouldn't take much for one of them to decide she was the leak, whether it was true or not. That night, she barely slept. Every sound outside her window made her sit up, heart hammering, imagining a knock at the door or a shadow at the glass. The next day, Pretos sent a message. "Need to see you. Now." Her first thought was that this was it, the moment everything came crashing down. But when she got to the meeting spot, it wasn't a confrontation. It was an instruction. "You're going to deliver something," he said. "No questions. No delays." The package was small, wrapped in brown paper and sealed with tape. He didn't tell her what was inside, and she didn't ask. But the way he looked at her, sharp, assessing, told her this wasn't just a delivery. It was a test of loyalty, of nerve, maybe even of whether she could still be trusted after the raid. The address he gave her was across town, in an area she didn't know well. She walked there, every step feeling heavier, the package burning a hole in her bag. When she handed it over to the man waiting at the door, he didn't speak. Just took it, closed the door, and left her standing on the step. Back at the meeting point, Pretos only asked one thing. "Anyone stop you?" She shook her head. "Good," he said, before walking away without another word. She'd passed, but she wasn't sure if that meant she was safer now, or deeper in than ever. After the raid, the atmosphere changed in ways that didn't need to be spoken. The Micra still cruised the usual streets, deals still happened in the same shadows, but there was a tension under it all. A sense that they were being watched from more than one direction. Because it wasn't just the police anymore. Word spread quickly that rival groups had noticed the arrest. And predators smell weakness. Guys she'd never seen before started hanging around at the edges of the estate. Flashy trainers, loud laughter, eyes that followed her a second too long when she passed. It was a quiet kind of invasion at first, like they were testing the water. One evening, she was walking to meet Pretos when a car she didn't recognize slowed alongside her. The window rolled down. "You don't need to be hanging with those clowns," a voice said. Not aggressive, just casual, like they were offering her a ride home. She kept walking, but the man in the passenger seat leaned out, grinning. "We pay better, and we don't let the police use our phones." The car rolled on, leaving her with a cold knot in her stomach. They knew. They all knew. When she told Glenn later, his reaction was explosive. "They think they can poach from us? Nah, we'll show them who they're messing with." But Pretos' expression was different, sharper, calculating. "They're not scared of us right now," he said quietly. "And that's a problem." The next week was chaos. People were being moved around like chess pieces. Meetings happened in new places at strange hours. She was sent on errands that seemed pointless, picking up empty bags, delivering envelopes to people she'd never seen before. It felt less like business and more like posturing, showing anyone watching that they still had control. But the rivals didn't back off. One night, the Micra pulled into the park to find another car already there. Tinted windows, bass thudding from inside. The two groups sat in their cars, engines running, staring each other down like animals in the wild. Nothing happened, but the silence felt louder than shouting. That night, Pretos gave her a warning she'd never heard from him before. "If someone offers you anything, money, a lift, whatever, you say no. Doesn't matter who it is. Doesn't matter what they promise. You stay with us." She nodded, but inside, her thoughts were spinning. Because for the first time, she wasn't sure staying with them was the safer option. It happened on a Friday night, the kind of night where the air feels thick, like even the weather knows something's about to break. She was in the Micra with Glenn and Pretos when they turned down a narrow side street near the old industrial estate, and saw them. Two cars parked nose to nose in the middle of the road, blocking the way. The rival crew. The doors opened almost in sync. Half a dozen men spilled out, moving slow, deliberate, like they had all the time in the world. Pretos cut the engine. Glenn's hand disappeared into his jacket. No one said a word, but the space between the two groups was electric, one spark away from exploding. One of the rivals called out first. "Word is, you've been slipping, letting people walk, letting the cops sniff around." Glenn laughed, but it wasn't a friendly sound. "Word is, you've got too much mouth for someone who's still breathing." The insults didn't last long before the first shove landed. Then it was chaos, fists, shouts, the dull thud of bodies hitting metal. She pressed herself against the side of the car, heart hammering, every instinct screaming at her to run. But then one of the rivals broke from the melee and came straight toward her. "You don't need to be part of this," he said quickly, voice low. "Come with us, right now. We'll keep you safe." For a split second, she froze. On one side, the people who'd trapped her for months. On the other, strangers who saw her as leverage, a prize to win in someone else's war. There was no good choice. In the end, she did the only thing that might keep her alive in the moment. She stepped back toward the Micra, into Glenn's line of sight. It wasn't loyalty, it was survival. The rival's face tightened, like he'd just lost something valuable. He turned away, rejoining the fight. Minutes later, the sound of sirens cut through the night. Both groups scattered, cars peeling away in different directions. In the chaos, she caught a glimpse of Preto's face in the rearview mirror. He wasn't looking at the road. He was looking at her, studying her. And she knew he'd seen that moment. The hesitation, the possibility. The sirens faded, but the tension didn't. For hours after the fight, her phone stayed quiet. No messages.
No instructions.
Just silence, the kind that makes you wonder if you've been cut loose, or if they're deciding what to do with you. When it finally buzzed, the message was short. Meet us. Alone. She found them at a deserted car park on the edge of town. The Micra was parked under a flickering light, its shadow stretching across the cracked asphalt. Preto's leaned against the bonnet. Glenn sat on the curb, smoking, watching her with that unreadable expression. You hesitated last night, Preto said. No greeting, no build-up. Why? She swallowed. I didn't know what was happening. I panicked. Glenn exhaled smoke, eyes narrowing. Looked to me like you were thinking about walking. Her mind raced. A flat denial would sound weak. An admission would be suicide. She chose the middle ground. I'm still here, aren't I? For a moment, no one spoke. Then Preto's pushed off the bonnet, stepping closer. You've been solid for us. But solid doesn't mean untouchable. You understand. She nodded, keeping her face blank. Because she did understand better than they realized. That night, she made her decision. Not about loyalty, she'd never truly been loyal to them, but about survival. If she stayed, she'd be pulled deeper until there was no version of herself left to save. If she left, she'd be hunted, but at least she'd be running on her own terms. It wasn't a dramatic escape. No stolen car, no midnight chase. Just a slow withdrawal. Changing her routines, avoiding meeting spots, finding excuses not to answer messages. First, they pushed. Then the pushes turned to threats. And then, nothing. Whether they'd been distracted by bigger problems or decided she wasn't worth the effort, she didn't know. What she did know was that the silence that once terrified her now felt like oxygen. But the cost was still there, in nightmares, in the way she scanned every crowd, in the guilt that still sat heavy for the girl she'd pulled into their orbit. Freedom, she learned, wasn't the absence of danger. It was the chance to keep moving despite it. And for the first time in a long time, she was moving toward something, not just away.